Hello, this is Canonical, the podcast that takes literature out of the classroom. I'm James Xiao, and with me are my co-hosts Iad Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hey, good evening.
This week we are reviewing the third and last book in our series on Rich Country, Poor Country, Abdulrazak Gurnah's Paradise. We previously read Ko-eun's The Disaster Tourist and Viet Nguyen's The Sympathizer. You can find those episodes in our archives. If you would like to find us online, we are on social media at Canonical Pod and on Reddit at rCanonicalPod. So this book was my pick for this series. I had wanted to read a novel that had as its focus the relationship between two countries that were less commonly explored in English literature. I had learned about Gurnah after he received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2021, and what interested me about him and Paradise in particular was his depiction of historical Arab colonialism of East Africa. We often see colonialism as the West coming to dominate the rest of the world, but I'm curious about what these other lesser studied interactions between the powerful and the less powerful looked like. So Abdulrazak Gurnah was born in Zanzibar, an archipelago of Tanzania. He and his family fled Zanzibar for the UK when he was 20 years old during the Zanzibar Revolution, when the Arab government was overthrown and Tanzanians of Arab heritage were targeted by revolutionaries. In the UK, he received a PhD in English from the University of Kent, and like Viet Nguyen, the last writer we read, he is also a professor of post-colonial literary criticism, though Gurnah's focus is on the African diaspora. He has written 10 novels and a number of short stories alongside his critical work, and as noted earlier, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature for 2021.
One thing that's strange about Tanzania and Zanzibar is they kind of have a Hong Kong and China sort of situation, or a Taiwan and China sort of situation, where there are people who say, no, these are two separate countries, and then there are other people who are saying, oh, they're really the same thing. And I'm not sure how Gurnah feels about that, but I would like to know.
Yeah, it's one of these situations that arose from the post-colonial mess, right? Where we're really not sure if this is a state or not a state. One thing I thought was interesting was the last sultan who was overthrown. He fled after the coup, and then he moved to Portsmouth with his family.
Well, he actually moved to Oman recently.
Oh, did he?
He was able to go to Oman after many years living in Portsmouth. That's got to be interesting because that's kind of this dull middle class sort of English city. And you find out your neighbor used to be the Sultan of Zanzibar.
Yeah. So I had seen on Wikipedia that that sultan was listed as a notable person of Portsmouth. And there are all kinds of notable people who live in big cities like New York or London, and they don't get listed because, they have tons of ex-royalty, etc. So, what does this say about Portsmouth? That one of their notable people is this overthrown king, and now he doesn't even live there anymore. What a blow to the prestige of Portsmouth. But anyway, enough about Portsmouth and the former sultan. Let's get back to the book. Paradise is set in Tanzania in the early 1900s. It's a historical travel narrative and a coming-of-age story, bildungsroman. It tells the story of a boy named Yusuf who, as a result of his family's debt, becomes an indentured servant to the Arab merchant who he calls Uncle Aziz. I'm calling him an indentured servant, even though there are some reviewers and readers who call him a slave. For me, it's pretty clearly an indentured servant situation. I don't know how you guys felt about it.
It is indentured servitude because he's indentured as long as the debt is outstanding. Theoretically, he could be freed at any moment, but basically Aziz took the debt because he knew that his father would never be able to pay it.
So at a young age, Yusuf goes to live with Aziz and works in a shop with another indentured servant, an older boy named Khalil. When he grows older, Yusuf joins Aziz's caravan as they go on a dangerous trade mission inland to the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Over the course of the novel, he learns more about who Aziz is and the secrets that he keeps.
I'm curious why you call it a travel narrative.
I think it's pretty clearly a travel narrative. He is kind of a passive observer who is a stranger in a strange land. From the beginning of the book, he's taken away from his home village, and throughout the book, you kind of see his sense of confusion or loss because every part that he goes to is kind of new for him. And the second half of the book is, for me, what makes it very clear that it's a travel narrative because he goes on a trip to the interior of Tanzania, and you get the sense that he is observing this strange land. It's kind of written in the tradition of a lot of other travel narratives like that, where you get a sense that he is going somewhere strange and different, and his role is to relay that to you.
I would say that it's not travel centric. Like, he does describe what he sees, and he is passive, but it's not like he's in wonder of the world, and that's why he's describing it. He's just a generally kind of naive sort of character. So the reason why I'm hesitant to call it a travel narrative, because it's more about a character who doesn't understand things, who happens to go on a trip.
For me, I don't know if being in a state of wonder is what defines a travel narrative, because in this book, what I see is a focus on the setting, on the time and place. And Yusuf always seems to have this role of relaying to us what it was like at that time and in that place. So for me, that's what makes it clearly a historical travel narrative. But anyway, let's talk about what we thought about this book. I actually really liked this book. It's deceptively simple. Gurnah's prose is straightforward, and the plot lacks the forward momentum of the literary thrillers of the last couple of books we read. Instead, the reader is carried along by the novelty of the setting, German colonial Africa, which isn't very present in Western consciousness. So that's a treat because it's something new. And as I mentioned before, this was what was particularly interesting to me and why I sought out this book. I really liked the depiction of the relationship between the Arab, Indian, and Swahili people who were living in Tanzania at the time. But beyond that surface level enjoyment of this discovery of the new, I think the book does have some interesting ideas. And that's what I ended up really enjoying about this book because even though it seems, as I said, deceptively simple, there are quite a few ideas that the reader can grapple with and meditate on over the course of reading the novel.
I really enjoyed it in general, but there are moments in the book, moments on the journey, especially, and then toward the very end that really elevated it for me, that took it from just a good book to a great book. I think the simplicity of the prose kept my expectations kind of low so that when those moments come up, they really stand out and really captured my attention. Like, I don't want to get too specific, especially the section at the end. I would say it's like the last quarter. There are changes that happen that made me reconsider the entire book.
James, you had mentioned the lack of momentum. And I think that it's true. It doesn't have this kind of forward movement that we find in other books that are plot driven. But at the same time, I do think that this book had a lot more plot than I would have expected from the kind of Nobel Prize category of books, you know? It isn't excessively intellectual, it's much more driven by people doing things and things happening. And that to me, I think, contributed to it being so easy to read. Gurna doesn't waste a lot of time talking about things. There are new ideas and new things happening throughout the novel. And that I found was very engaging. But like you said, a lot of the real thematic content is always under the surface of that.
I think he hides the thematic content behind a naive protagonist who doesn't fully understand the world around him. So, over the course of the book, you feel like, okay, there's not much going on, but then you realize there is a lot going on. It's just Yusuf doesn't really understand what's going on.
Also, he's, like you mentioned before, he's very passive. So he watches a lot of things happen more than he comments on them. He very rarely speaks out about the things that he sees, right? Even when asked directly by another character, he often says nothing. So he's almost just this pair of eyes, but he is a little more than that. More people comment about him than he comments about others.
Yeah, I think that's the narrative arc and also his character arc in this novel is that he is so naive, and what makes the novel a bildungsroman is his coming into consciousness of who he is in this world and what his society is really like. And for a reader like me who doesn't know a lot about this history, we get to experience this world in parallel with him, which is an enjoyable experience.
So, we're trying not to spoil the book, but I'd like to talk about generally what the arc of the book is. So, one arc is, as we mentioned, it's a Bildungsroman. So, at the start of the book, he's quite naive, and at the end, I think he begins to understand what his station is in this society. And the way he does this is throughout the book. Gurnah introduces characters who are of different classes, and he places them in juxtaposition with each other. Like, for example, there's the Indian mechanic that he meets and befriends. There's the store owner who he lives with for an undetermined period of time. And that store owner, we find out, is beholden to Aziz. There's his own father, who is also beholden to Aziz. So Yusuf doesn't understand this power dynamic at the beginning of the book. Not really. But it becomes much clearer to him and to us at the end. Are there any other developments like this on the idea level that you see in this novel?
I think the biggest thing is the presence of the indigenous people in this area. And then you also have the Arabs and the Indians in this area. But then looming on the horizon is just kind of this shadow of the Germans. And how will the presence of this new power that is substantially different from the existing powers change the situation? And as the book progresses, it becomes more and more clear what this German presence in the region is going to mean for all of their lives.
Yeah, it's treated as this inevitability in a very dark way, but when we see glimpses of the Germans, it's very curious because they range from indifferent to all powerful, and it kind of depends on the whim of the Germans.
Well, they're kind of described in mythic ways, right?
Right.
I think one of the characters speculates that they eat metal.
Like they're almost impervious. Yeah. Even when they're described in horrible ways, like there's a character that has like a face like a, oh, I forget what they say, like a melted face. He sounds like he's undead. It's like all the characters recognize that they're human, but that they're somehow also more than human.
One of the most interesting developments for me is at the beginning of the novel, it seems like Yusuf lives in a stateless society where power relationships are mainly personal. For example, he is sold into indentured servitude by his father to pay off a debt, and this sale is a private agreement between his father and Aziz. But over the course of the book, we start to see power relationships that are greater than that between individuals. Like, for example, there's a section where he is held prisoner, and it's a local sultan or lord who is imprisoning him. And after that, we find out there's an even greater power, the colonial power, that steps in. So at the beginning, it seems like it's a stateless power structure where individuals exert power over other individuals. But at the end, there's an image of the state rounding people up. So this kind of movement or development was very interesting to me, and it's indicative of the kind of subtlety that we can find in Gurnah's writing, because you can appreciate the novel without considering all of that, but it's there for you to find if you think deeper about it.
He also plays with different ideas like servitude and paradise. I don't know if I would say he defines those terms differently, but he shows different views of those things over the course of the book. And through Yusuf, we understand how those things work in the natural world in different ways, or how they can be defined by one person in one way and defined by another person in another way.
Another aspect of the book I found interesting was how all of the relationships seem transactional. I don't have an overarching thesis for this, but it's present throughout, where characters want something from another character and they come to an agreement over what their desire is worth. This is, of course, symbolized by Aziz, who is a merchant, but it is also present in all of the other relationships as well.
Yeah. Like even when Khalil is explaining how relationships work between, say, a man and a woman, it's very transactional, and Yusuf is kind of disgusted by it, and Khalil is trying to tell him, no, you don't have to be disgusted. These are two people that have needs, and we met each other's needs. I think you're right. There is a very transactional nature to everything in the book.
There is, I think, and that's kind of what I'm going to be bringing up in the next episode, is basically about how there is a shift in ideas that I think happening as history progresses between these different sets of characters and the way they think about the world they live in. What I will say, without getting too far into that line of thinking, is that while it is something that I can discover, something quite elaborate in, I don't think Gurna is particularly invested in presenting the theme and ensuring that you grasp it. I think it is remarkable how confident a writer he seems to be, because he does not elaborate his writing. It's very plain, and he doesn't embellish his writing with any particular style. So, in contrast to another novel that I think we all really enjoyed, Jenny Ophel's Weather, that novel was marked very clearly by a certain style. And in this novel, what's different and striking about it is you never see Gurna reaching for that. It just seems like he has this supreme confidence to just plainly state what's going on, and he doesn't seem to care if you understand really or not.
Do you think that's made easier by having a set of eyes like Yusuf? Things flow through him. He's more of a conduit than he is a narrator.
That's part of it, but I think another part of it is that the world that Yusuf lives in is very much different from the worlds that we live in. The world is distinct and interesting on its own. Whereas I think a novel set in contemporary times, in the world that we live in, would need something else to establish itself as remarkable.
So, even though Gurnah is a literature professor in post colonial studies, this book isn't very postmodern. We've read postmodern books before, like Nabokov's Pale Fire or Ophel's Weather, where it's obviously postmodern. This book feels very traditional. The story is almost Dickensian in that he's trying to tell the story of a young boy and the forces that surround and buffet that boy. This kind of old fashioned story, it's not really the kind of book that we seek out. I mean, it's not uncommon, but we don't tend to gravitate toward that book. If you told me that this was written 75 years ago, I actually wouldn't be very surprised. And this isn't a criticism, since I actually really enjoyed Paradise. In fact, I think it's a kind of palate cleanser for us, given the books that we read recently.
That impression that you're talking about, I think, is it's gratifying to the reader, or it establishes the novel as literary in the sense that the reader might expect, because it seems to float outside of, trends in fiction. It floats outside of the contemporary world, and it seems like it's meant to speak to something more durable and universal, because it is very much out of our time, but not really of any other time as well.
So let's talk about his Nobel Prize win. We only read one book, this one, but if we had to speculate, why do you think he won the Nobel? And do you think he's worthy of this prize?
It's hard to judge from one novel, even though I did really enjoy this. But I think if I can judge his other work based on this, I get the sense that Nobels are often given for bodies of work that kind of speak to more of humanity than just a small corner of it. And one of the things that was interesting to me in this book is how there's no condemnation, really, of any group of people, even though he easily could have. One of the things that I think we're going to talk about in subsequent episodes is how one of the characters, Aziz, talks about what has happened before the Germans, how the Arabs come, and what happened before that. That this is almost of a natural order of things. It's not a good order, but it's also not something that that character at least sees as the end of things. It's more a progression of things.
I want to expand on that a little bit, Sam. I mentioned earlier that what I wanted to read for this series was a book that was not focused on Western colonialism. And the reason why was because I think it's hard for us to see history without the lens of Western colonialism. In the end, I think this book did deliver on that. It showed us the tensions between the Arabs, Indians, and Swahili in that region during that time. And this is not something that we often consider, since we are almost trapped in our Western centric view when we look at history. As to why he won the Nobel Prize always strikes me as a more political prize than other literary awards. Do you think this is a political book? Because I think it does come across as a political book, albeit, as I mentioned earlier, a subtle one.
I think that it's perhaps not a political prize, but it's not an aesthetically minded prize. In their guidelines for who wins and qualifies for the award, they say that the candidate should have bestowed, quote, the greatest benefit on mankind, writing in a, quote, idealistic direction. So it's not like art for art's sake. I think the Nobel Prize is really concerned with some sort of idealistic way that art can benefit humanity.
Do you see that in this book?
I would say that it is an educational experience to read this book. And I think, as you mentioned, it opens the door to another part of colonialism that most people don't think about. So, in that respect, I think that it does have something to offer in terms of these kind of idealistic goals for the prize.
Two other Nobel Prize winners that we've read include Toni Morrison and Jose Saramago, and they're definitely more overtly political. But I think I can see Gurnah belonging in that pantheon.
It's just hard to judge from a single book, even though if you told me all of his books were like this, I could go, okay, yeah, I see why he won.
Are you interested in reading more from Gurnah?
Yeah, I think so.
I would read more, but I'm not excited. It's not flashy.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mentioned those moments in the book that elevated the rest of the book. Those stuck out for me, but they are few. Like you said, James, this is a very quiet book. Or no, Ian said that, I think.
We are actually the same person.
You really are.
Same,
Yeah.
same.
We're just two facets of your imagination.
I'm just having a conversation with my two other personalities.
All three of us are drawn to postmodernism in different ways, and I think reading a book like this, it's just not what we typically are drawn to.
Well, like you said, it feels old-fashioned. It feels like it's from an earlier time.
All right, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. If you thought we were off base with our review of this book, you can find us on Reddit or on social media at CanonicalPod to let us know. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can give us a nice review on Apple or your podcast platform of choice. Over the next 2 weeks, we will be back with 2 in-depth discussions of Paradise. If you're interested in joining that discussion, go ahead and find a copy of this book. Till then, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.